Okay, I think we're live. Thank you guys for joining me tonight to kind of talk about pandemic pods. For those of you watching this video right now, Ben and Leah and Ben and Kristen have been so gracious to share a little bit of their experience having a pod with their two families during this pandemic. So we're going to jump into some questions and they're going to answer them. And hopefully this will help you if you've been thinking about it or you've been interested in starting this with another family during this time. So let's get right into it. So we'll start with the Pharaohs and then go to the Waybrights. Why did you guys originally want to create a pod with another family? What was the reason you got started with this idea?
Yep, so a few months into the pandemic when things were not looking like they were getting better anytime soon, our family was just really weary of just being our own little island and being at home or going somewhere just as a family. Our kids were really bad at wearing masks at that point, and distancing was just like so hard. Lucy was 1.5, and it was just not working. So we were looking for a way to have some fellowship and friendship in a setting where we wouldn't have to worry about the masks and the distancing, and where we could just be a little more normal again and have those friendships for our kids, for them to be able to play and just like let down their guard completely and just be kids again. And where we could do that as well. So that was kind of our main motivation for reaching out to the Waybrights and asking if they wanted to be in a pod with us.
Yeah, and when the Pharaohs approached us, it felt kind of like they were asking us to go steady. It was really, really kind of funny, but very sweet. We had a Zoom meeting and we discussed the whole idea of being in a pod. And for us, we really felt like our kids were having a hard time at home. And we also were having a hard time being away from our church family. We were just tired and grumpy, and our attitudes were not very good. So being able to have face-to-face connection, being able to share life sounded very appealing to us, and just being able to connect.
Right. Thanks for sharing. I appreciate that. So as you were kind of going through this process, what were some considerations you thought of before potting up per se? So what were some things you may have thought of before starting the pod?
I think one thing I was really aware of was that basically in exchange for the extra freedom with your pod mates, it's potentially a lot more vigilance with the rest of the world. You know, the way I was thinking about it was basically it's now twice as many people who could get exposed and twice as many people at risk if anyone has exposure. And so I was going into it really attentive to that need for extra discipline in all our other interactions in exchange for that extra level of freedom within the pod.
And I do want to temper that with saying that you don't have to necessarily like totally lock down all your interactions with everyone outside your pod. But it's really about being open about what interactions you do have and making sure that your pod mates are okay with those. So there could be a scenario where two families are both having some interactions outside of the pod, but they're open about that and they're both okay with what the other family is doing.
Right. What about you guys, Waybrights? Did you have any things you kind of thought of beforehand or considerations you made?
Yeah, for us, we have a lot of moving parts. So we have Zach going to and from his mom's house. Right. So we had to think about how many layers of contact that our family would have versus the Pharaohs, who have been able to be more contained, and discussing that ahead of time, making sure they understood fully where we would be in contact with different exposures or potential exposures, and keep open because there's a lot that we don't have control over.
Right. That makes sense. Thanks again for sharing. I feel like I need to say that after every question, but I appreciate it. So let's get to the fun stuff. What have been some benefits during this? I mean, it's been almost a year of you guys living in this way. So what have been some things that you've really enjoyed? And we'll start right with you, Leah, if you wouldn't mind sharing.
For us, we have really had so many benefits. Of course, there are the times when we've had medical emergencies and we had someone to take care of our kids while we were at the hospital with one of our other children. And it was more than just having someone take care of our kids, but knowing that they were safe and there wasn't additional exposure for them. But also having people who understood our kids and love our children well, and really just give a lot of grace for them when they're just being kids.
What about you guys, Pharaohs? What have been some benefits you've enjoyed?
Yeah, one of the things I was missing most before we potted up was having people around my table and being able to cook meals and share meals around the table. So that's something that I've really enjoyed. We've had many dinners together and a lot of brunches together too. We've been doing a lot of brunch, and that's just so much fun. And I feed their kids snacks all the time. They love my buttered bread. Is their thing they always request while they're over here. So that's been a delight to be able to share meals together. And then we've also gotten to do some childcare swaps. So times when I can actually just drop my kids off and know that they're going to have a blast playing with their friends, and Leah is going to take care of them, and I can go do something that I need to do, like go grocery shopping or have a little time to myself or whatever. And we've had some date nights as well, where we swap, take a weekend, and we're like, okay, we'll watch your kids Friday night, you watch ours Saturday night, or whatever it is. So that's been a delight as well.
And I've eaten all of your cooking before, so I can definitely, I'm sure that like sharing meals has been fantastic for sure. So this kind of brings us to, there are obviously benefits to a pod. You guys have shared a lot of those, but there are probably some difficulties as well. So if you guys wouldn't mind sharing, what have been some difficulties, either foreseen or unforeseen difficulties that kind of came up during this time?
Yeah, I can take that. First, I'm really grateful with how it has turned out. Like the Waybrights have been really excellent podmates. I'm so grateful for the level of consideration, transparency, just like the teamwork that we've sensed. It really feels like we're working together to make this work in a really beautiful way. But I think one of the difficulties that I didn't anticipate was how much things will keep changing and how you have to kind of remain flexible and keep figuring things out. Like I kind of went into it thinking like, we'll figure out our plan, figure out everybody's boundaries, like all the contingencies, and then we'll just like do that. And it really doesn't work that way. It's like the situation keeps changing. Like, I mean, our kids have the option to go back to school maybe, or different things come up. And I've really had to start thinking of it as an evolving situation that we're navigating together, but with continued flexibility, like new communication, new ingenuity, like just figuring out how we all feel about something we never even thought about before. Like a good example is we had a relative who was going to stay at our house, or just come for a visit from out of town, and we had figured out kind of some of the factors in advance. But when they got here, it turned out they had actually had quite a bit more exposure to more people than we realized just before they arrived, and so we talked with Ben and Leah, and we talked with the relative, and we kind of all worked together, and it was not really what we had expected, and honestly, not quite what we wanted, but we figured out a plan that everybody was pretty content with. The relative masked and cut their visit a little short, and we figured it out, and basically, it was a good example of having to work together on the fly to figure out how to deal with a situation that we hadn't anticipated until it was already happening.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that story. Waybrights, could you think of any kind of difficulties or any things that you maybe weren't expecting that came up?
The first thing I think of is, on some levels, it involved a sacrifice of what. Sorry.
Kids, right? There's benefits and difficulties as they go.
We just had one upstairs who was very quiet. I think she got back to that, whoever it was.
That's okay. Sorry, Ben. Sorry to interrupt.
That's okay. There was somewhat of a sacrifice of having to change what I would normally do, what I felt safe with, taking my kids to do an activity, but then having to consider, well, what would the Pharaohs think? or just inherently this is going to increase, exposure or any risk. And so at that point, I could say, well, no, it's probably something I shouldn't be doing. And on the other hand, it's a good thing. It's greater accountability for my decisions.
Right.
But it's not, it was a little unexpected to have to, it felt like a sacrifice.
Right. For sure. And, with those sacrifices, I'm sure you guys had a lot of good things come out of it too. And we were talking a little bit, obviously, before we started recording about the benefits that came out of that sacrifice and kind of some really examples of how this is a reflection of how the church should interact with each other and how taking other people's considerations was almost magnified in this element. So I appreciate both of you sharing that. I know it's not easy to kind of talk about difficulties, but I think it's important for people to remember too, right? Things will come up, but I really like how both of you kind of said, there's that communication piece. You have to think of the other person. And so that kind of brings us to our last couple of questions. And that last question is, I'd love a couple of you to answer. What is like a must-have? If someone were thinking about starting a pod with another family, what is something that you would definitely suggest as a must-have? And if we wouldn't mind starting, Ben, if you could answer that one.
Yeah, sure. I'd say just when in doubt, talk about it. Like I'm the kind of person who's so shy that when someone gives me coffee, I'm too nervous to ask if there's sugar available. But like there's so many situations that came up where it's just like this weird little edge case, or there's a chance they might care, or you're not quite sure. And I always felt this resistance to just pop a little text, but I was always so glad when I did. It's like if 19 times out of 20 it's no issue, it's no issue. And if 1 time out of 20 it was going to be an issue, it's much better to ask and figure it out together, or just like have that transparency and like the vulnerability and communication, rather than to just go ahead and then potentially wreck it in a way that really causes a problem for the other family, or really causes an issue in the communication and the trust levels.
Right.
Yeah, I think that hits the nail on the head. The trust, the must-have is just trusting that you can ask your friends a question if they're comfortable with the scenario, and you will trust that they're going to tell you the truth. And that was difficult at first, but almost immediately it was liberating and just allowed us to grow closer as friends. But it also really made the pod work better because we knew we could trust each other to let each other know that if we weren't comfortable with something.
Right. It's really good. I appreciate those must-haves. And I think that really brings me to the end of my list of questions, but I did want to leave one last kind of, do you have any final thoughts that as we were speaking, you're like, oh, I really wanted to say this, but I didn't get a chance, or anything else you'd love to share with your church family about pods?
Well, one thing I just thought of was I wasn't prepared to have as many awkward conversations with other people about protecting our pod as we had to have, but you have to have a willingness to kind of have those awkward conversations with other individuals and do it with as much tact and love and grace as possible. But you have to be honest with other people so that you can protect your pod and really put your family and the other family first. And I didn't anticipate having to have so many uncomfortable conversations with people, but it's so worth it.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks. Any other people with any last thoughts, final thoughts?
I was surprised by, honestly, it almost starts feeling like a Christian discipline. Like it turned out to be a very Christian thing. It's this act of pretty radical trust and vulnerability of like really not judging people who haven't, like a lighter standard, or being considerate of people who have a tighter standard, and practicing hospitality. And, it really has bonded us in Christ in a deeper way than I expected, honestly. Like, I thought it would just be like a social benefit and a, kind of a matter of planning and communicating and being good friends. But I didn't expect there to be such an element of sort of Christian discipline and richness to it.
So good. That's fantastic. And I appreciate it. I hope you guys don't mind, now that you're out there, if people come to you with questions. Obviously, I've heard stories from you guys that have been really cool to hear. And so I hope that people don't feel like they can't approach you and be like, hey, how was a pod? But I also hope that this video helped a lot of people kind of understand a little bit more of what it actually means to be in a pandemic pod. Thank you guys so much for sacrificing a little bit of your Sunday evening to join me for this fireside chat, as I called it in the email. But I can't say thank you enough. You guys have been fantastic. So thanks again.
You're welcome.